Windows on the World live every Sunday, 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Join me, Mark Windows, and Tony Hurst. Join the conversation in our chat box and also catch up with life-changing information on our continuous program stream at windowsontheworld.net. I saw a YouTube video, it was actually an audio interview with someone called Jerry Marzinsky, and Jerry's a psychiatric practitioner with a very long career, and it includes working in psychiatric institutions, prisons and rehabilitation centres as a psychiatric rehabilitation counsellor and alcohol substance abuse clinician. These are some of the titles he's worked under. He also led the psychiatric rehabilitation team at Central State Hospital, Milledgeville, Georgia, which housed 2,000 patients and was notoriously described by chief clinical psychologist P.G. Cranford in 1952. He stated it witnessed the heights of man's humanity and the depth of his degradation. That was in his book, But for the Grace of God. Now, Jerry observed the behaviour of paranoid schizophrenic patients and came to the conclusion that the voices they heard were not random hallucinations, but actually possession by demonic entities. This show will give examples of research into this subject and the conclusion that demons are real. So what I'm going to do is give Jerry the floor here and let him tell us a bit about how this started and how he started to come to these conclusions.
Well, to start with, I think the reason I found this stuff is because I've always had a very deep distrust of authority. It was kind of bred into me as a child. I mean, I never fully trusted authority for thing after thing after thing. So, you know, when I got into undergraduate psych at Temple University in Philadelphia, what I found was that they expected you to just listen to everything they were telling you, absorb these textbooks, regurgitate it back, and there was no way to actually see for yourself whether there was any truth to what they were saying. I mean, an undergraduate could not access a clinical population of schizophrenics. You couldn't go into a state hospital or a mental health center. You just basically had to take, you know, what they're telling you and assume it's the truth. But that's not an assumption I was raised with. So I was uncomfortable with, you know, the not having any way to verify things. I mean, in experimental psychology, it was different. You could go into a lab, you can run these experiments with rats, you could see the different reinforcement schedules, you could actually see and watch it happen. But with abnormal psych and social psych and clinical psych and all these other things, there was no way to verify that. And I was real uncomfortable with that. And then some stuff.
I think it's really important to put in at this point that there is actually no objective testing for the psychiatric defined illness.
Well, they have something called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is kind of like their holy grail. But there is no lab test for schizophrenia or any other mental illness. They don't exist. Yeah. You know, so basically, you're having to listen to what psychiatry is saying and believe what they're saying. You know, that wasn't part of who I was. And the first time I started suspecting something was off was when I was taking, I loved abnormal psychology. I mean, I was just fascinated by it. And there was one research article that they gave us to read, which basically was written by a psychologist, and it stated that two delusional patients with the same exact delusion, if they met each other, one of them would have to give way and change his delusion. And I looked at that and I went, why in the world would that ever happen? I mean, you got two crazy people, both of them crazy. Why would one have to change his delusion if the other one insisted he was something? You know, so one says he's Napoleon, the other one says he's Napoleon. Why would one have to change? I mean, what sense did that make? And it just sat wrong with me. So I kind of put it in the back of my mind. And years later, let me tell you a little bit about, well, I don't know. I checked this out when I got to Central State Hospital. That was the biggest psychiatric hospital in the world at the time. I think the population when I got there was something like 11,000 patients or something to that effect. But I was on one of the wards one day, and I saw a new patient come in, and he was wandering around kind of aimlessly, and I went to introduce myself, and I said, hey, what's your name, man? You know, he said, well, I'm Jesus Christ. You know, and that memory from the back of my mind that, you know, hey, if two crazy people had the same delusion, they both insisted they were the same thing, one of them would have to give way. So I looked at him, and I looked him straight in the eye, and I said, no, man, you can't be Jesus Christ, because I am. And I looked him straight in the eye, and I'm waiting to see what happened. And he looks confused. He looks away for a second, and then he looks back, and he looks me in the eye, and he goes, well, we can both be Jesus Christ. And he walks away. And I'm like, okay, you know, what else were they feeding me back then that wasn't true? What other garbage was in those books? You know, and you look at the references on those books, and here one professor got the reference from another professor who got the reference from another professor who got it from somebody else who might have done something, some experiment. But, you know, it was like intellectual incest. They were just quoting each other. It reminded me of these little fish I saw while I was scuba diving one day. They lived in these little holes with mounds of gravel around each hole. And I was watching these guys for hours. You know, it's a whole community of them. And when one left to go steal a rock from somebody else, another fish came and stole one of his rocks and went back and put it on his nest. And I was fascinated by this. And the only fish that were bringing in fresh material to aid the community were the ones on the very outskirts who would wander off into the strangeness out of the protective community, grab a pebble from outside the community and bring it back in. They were the only ones adding new information, and I was just fascinated with that. So, you know, that when I hit that, I went, what else? I mean, everything became suspect because everything that I didn't see with my own eyes became suspect. So I started work at Central State in 1975. And at that point, it was the largest psychiatric hospital in the world. That institution sprawled over 2,000 acres. It had 200 buildings. And in the 1950s, its population was 1,300 psychiatric patients. It had been around 175 years before I got there. It was instituted before the Civil War, and it was the only building that General Sherman left standing as he cut through Georgia during the Civil War and burned down a 30-mile swath. So,
yeah, well, apparently, according to the history of the place, local children would be threatened if they were misbehaving, that they would be sent there as a punishment. So it had a lot of deep imposing fear about it. And I've seen the kind of the derelict remains of it. Some of it's derelict, some of it's still there. But it's very, very creepy looking at the pictures. And it looks a place that will forever be haunted.
Yes, it is one of the most haunted places in the world right now. Matter of fact, the psychiatric unit that I was working at when I first went to work there, they have knocked it down and leveled it. It no longer exists. But yeah, it's a pretty creepy place, and I've got some stories that'll just send chills up your spine.
Yeah, I think you should actually go into those, Jerry, because these stories that you told really, really opened my mind up to things that I'd kind of been thinking along similar lines as yourself. Obviously, I'm not qualified, but I've been thinking along these lines for a very, very long time about these conditions like schizophrenia. And yeah, I think you should tell the listeners really anything that you can recall. And these stories are absolutely fascinating.
Well, yeah, I've got some horrendous stories. Let me write down where to put those in, because I'll use them to make a point.
Yeah, great. Well, I think what we're talking about here, it's very, very interesting. So we're going to go into what schizophrenia actually is, because we're going to be concentrating mainly on that, even though there are so many, many different mental illnesses now. And this DSM manual, which we're going to talk about tonight, contains ever more of these increasingly crazy sounding mental illness. Of course, we'd all be diagnosed with having a problem with authority on this show. I think there's a diagnosis for that was put in a couple of years ago. So we'd definitely all be diagnosed. There's three of us there. Me, you and Tony.
But I'm in the
with
right
people
place.
diagnosed with, I think it's some kind of affective disorder against authority. So they're making these things up all the time.
You brought up earlier, well, why don't they see these things? And all through, I mean, what was it? 8 years of higher education, 4 of graduate school, 4 of insight. I met my first psychotic patient after 6 years of school. I'd never seen a psychotic patient before that. Never, that was the first time I saw one after reading about it. And one thing that kind of surprised me is, all they talked about was, they're hallucinating. They're out of touch with reality. I had no idea that those hallucinations were voices talking to them. They never mentioned that. They never mentioned anything about what the voices say.
Well, this is the classic kind of interpretation of schizophrenia for lay people, isn't it? That it's people who hear voices. So this was never actually referred to, you're saying?
No, they did. They never said, they're hearing voices. They said, they're hallucinating. It's like, okay, they're crazy. They're hallucinating. Don't pay any attention to it. It doesn't mean anything. They're whacked out. I mean, it just doesn't relate to anything. It's got no significance. They're just hallucinating. And you could see the faces of the patients that psychiatrists were talking to when they started telling them about the voices, and the voices were saying, and the psychiatrist told them, you're just hallucinating. They were like a balloon that just deflated. It was like, he doesn't understand. So one of the first contradictions I saw was that all those psychiatrists insisted that these things were hallucinations. If they found out that the voices were telling the patient to kill themselves, all of a sudden everything changed. I mean, they reacted as if they were a real threat and somebody was coming to kill the patient. They would lock the patient up, they'd put them on suicide watch and fill them full of drugs. So they reacted to the voices as if they were absolutely real on one hand, but on the other hand, they were insisting that they were meaningless nothings. And they'd lock the patient down and fill them full of drugs. What incentive was there for that patient to talk to anybody about the voices after that, especially a psychiatrist? Now, if you look at the suicide rate of schizophrenics, whose voices often tell them to kill themselves, the suicide rate of schizophrenics over a lifetime is 10 to 22%. 4 in 10 schizophrenics will attempt suicide. The suicide rate of schizophrenics is 4 to 10 times the normal population. It's estimated that between 20 and 40% of schizophrenic males make at least one suicide attempt.
It's amazing. Now,
what kind of
I think at this
hallucination
point it'd be very good to go into what schizophrenia is and what it actually isn't, because there's some very blurred lines here with a lot of people, and the actual term schizophrenia puts fear into people because of the way it's portrayed.
Of course. It's a very scary thing. A lot of times these people are unpredictable. They're set off by, little or nothing. They react to stuff that isn't there or inaccurate perceptions. And I think psychiatrists to some degree are somewhat afraid of them based on their assault rate. So, to conclude that other thing, I asked myself, what kind of hallucination would tell hundreds of patients to kill themselves?
I just want to go into this medical definition of schizophrenia and the definition we're going to read out. Now, these are two opposing definitions of schizophrenia, and they're very core to what we're going to be talking about tonight. So the medical definition of schizophrenia and the definition we're going to read out are from the Journal of Religion and Health, and the opposing beliefs at the core of the battle between the state and those who see a bigger picture. One, that the atheistic state model and that of the pharmaceutical industry wants to shut down. This is what we get into. Now, schizophrenia, is described here as one of several brain diseases whose symptoms may include loss of personality, agitation, catatonia, confusion, psychosis, unusual behavior, and social withdrawal. The illness usually begins in early childhood, it says here. The cause of schizophrenia is not known, but there appear to be both genetic and environmental components to the disease. Schizophrenia is not caused by abuse or poor parenting practices. Now, that's going to come up later in the show, because it's very interesting and strange that they would put that in and say that schizophrenia is not caused by abuse or poor parenting practices. Treatment involves use of neuroleptic medicine and supportive interpersonal therapy. The prognosis is fairly good, with 2/3 of those diagnosed recovering significantly. I don't know what you've got to say about that, Jerry.
Well, I got a few things to say about that. First of all, I want to specify that what I'm talking about here is paranoid schizophrenia. There's a lot of different versions of schizophrenia. Catatonia, yes, where they're just kind of staring off into space in a rigid position. There's undifferentiated schizophrenia. There's hebephrenia. There's all kinds of different kinds of schizophrenia. But one of the biggest is paranoid schizophrenia, where they're hearing voices. And that's what the information I'm bringing you pertains to. So, yes, it doesn't pertain to any of those others. An ingrained delusional disorder, none of the stuff that I'll be talking about will have any effect on that.
No, that's very interesting and a very good delineation to make, because we were talking about the difference between impulses and voices, and they're totally different, aren't they?
Well, that's a complicated question.
Yeah. Let's just go. I just wanted to read this out, Jerry. This is from the Blanton Peel Institute, which has another description of schizophrenia, which is quite contradictory to the one we just heard. And it says schizophrenia is typically a lifelong condition characterized by acute symptom exacerbations and widely varying degrees of functioning disability. Some of its symptoms, such as delusions and hallucinations, produce great subjective psychological pain. The most common delusion types are as follows. My feelings and movements are controlled by others in a certain way, and they put thoughts in my head that are not mine. Hallucinatory experiences are generally voices talking to the patient or among themselves. Hallucinations are a cardinal positive symptom of schizophrenia, which deserves careful study in the hope it will give information about the pathophysiology of the disorder. We thought that many so-called hallucinations in schizophrenia are really illusions related to a real environmental stimulus. One approach to these hallucination problems is to consider the possibility of a demonic world. Demons are unseen creatures that are believed to exist in all major religions and have the power to possess humans and control their body. Demonic possession can manifest with a range of bizarre behaviors, which could be interpreted as a number of different psychotic disorders with delusions and hallucinations. The hallucinations in schizophrenia may therefore be an illusion, a false interpretation of a real sensory image formed by demons. A local faith healer in our region, it goes on, helps the patients with schizophrenia. His method of treatment seems to be successful because his patients become symptom-free after 3 months. Therefore, it would be useful for medical professionals to work together with faith healers to define better treatment pathways for schizophrenia. The last definition is so far outside the current belief system now promoted that those involved in psychiatry would invent another illness for their DSM manual for those believing it. It could be like something like religious and spiritual belief in demonic possession disorder. This is really kind of showing it in the bigger picture. But that second description of schizophrenia concurs much more with the conclusions that you came to. So that's why I read it out, Jerry.
Yes, that's virtually right on. It sounds like the work of Dr. Irmak in Turkey, who did witness a shaman cure schizophrenics, and then wrote a journal article and published it, and was attacked vehemently by the medical societies and his colleagues, accusing him of trying to drag the profession back to the Stone Age. The bottom line is these people were recovering. Yes, the voices that they call hallucinations run very well-defined specific patterns that are.
And that's something we should really go into, I think. Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point and a very important one, in that the way that this has been presented is that these are just hallucinations, and it's random, it's fragmented, and makes no sense. But your research pointed in the other direction, didn't it?
Yes, it sure did. And you're not going to find any of this stuff in their books and manuals, not at all. But there's a number of consistencies that when you look to study the voices, if they will just open their friggin' eyes and look and start asking questions instead of thinking they know it all and that these things are hallucinations and that's the end of it, they will see that the voices are not random. That's a biggie. They're not random like all other hallucinations. Other hallucinations are all over the place. These are consistently negative, derogatory, nasty, ugly put downs, and they're unswerving. They run that particular course, and it's predictable. Number two.
Now, one thing I wanted to bring up, Jerry, before we move on, is about that line in that kind of conventional interpretation of schizophrenia, where they make this really strange point of saying schizophrenia is not caused by abuse or poor parenting practices. Now, this I find very odd that they would put that in, and I
think it's not correct. I mean, when you look at these things, the voices are like sharks in the ocean. Right? Sharks can smell blood from miles away. Okay? These voices, these entities, can smell negative emotional energy from miles away. So, from my personal experience over years and years and years, most of the schizophrenics I've dealt with were badly, emotionally, sexually, or physically abused. It's like there was a already negative, template, where when you think negative, you produce negative emotion. The negative emotion, and it just spirals out of control. And these things are attracted to negative emotion. So most of the patients, I'd say a great majority of them, were either physically, sexually, or emotionally abused. Now, the other thing that opens people up to psychosis, and faster than anything I've ever seen, is methamphetamine. I've seen, while I was working with the criminally insane in the state prison for about 16 years, I think I was there, I've never seen so many go psychotic by using a drug as they did with amphetamine. They start hearing these voices periodically while they're high, and they go, oh, well, I was just hallucinating, and then they become more and more, and they go, they're just hallucinations, and they keep using the stuff. And then one day, they're there permanently, and they don't go away. That person is now psychotic. He's crazy. And the prisoners called amphetamine the devil's drug for good reason. And I've had prisoner after prisoner tell me when they ran out of amphetamine, their voices would tell them where to go to get it. And they'd show up at that place, and there'd be somebody with that drug right there. But we're skipping all over the place, but I'm just going to run with it, because trying to stay on track I don't think going to work.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think what it is, there's a lot of information to get over, and it's a very wide subject. But I think these first initial points that the symptoms or what could be behind this is extremely negative things happening to a person, and also the whole thing being opened up by the overuse of drugs, and especially amphetamines. And these seem to be gateways. So this negative experience, abuse, and terrible things happening to a person, terrible trauma, opens up this gateway for these entities or for this condition to take over.
Yeah, let me tell you some of the characteristics I first saw at the state hospital when I started noticing. These are other inconsistencies with there being hallucinations. One thing I saw is the schizophrenics did not want to go to church, where all other patients did. They had an ice cream social at the church. The chaplain was giving away free cake and ice cream. Schizophrenics stayed on the ward. They didn't want to go. And I was like, well, why are they staying on this dingy ward when they could be down having free cake and ice cream? So I started asking them questions, and they said the voices don't like churches. They get louder in church, and they don't want the patient to go there. All these guys, even if he thinks about going to church, the voices start, no, you don't want to go there. It's a bunch of crap. I'm like, well, what kind of hallucination would do that? So I started asking.
Sorry, Jerry, this is did you notice that this was a very, very common thing with schizophrenic patients?
Yeah,
I mean,
yes.
Was this the norm?
Yes, this is the norm. Matter of fact, depending on the strength of the voices, there were it broke down into 3 classes. So patients who had voices that weren't very strong and forced their way went to church, the voices would complain, but once they got into the church, the voices would shut up, just go dark, start quiet. If the voices were of moderate strength, they would babble on in the church, and they'd say bad things about the preacher and how stupid everything he was saying, and they'd get loud and they'd distract the patient so they couldn't hear what the preacher was saying. In the worst cases, they would get so loud that they would cause the patient massive headaches, and they would have to jump up and run out of that church to get some relief. This was consistent. Every time a patient picked up the Bible, they would start, oh, that's a bunch of crap, And it was really odd because a lot of the patients knew that the answer somehow was a return to a positive spirituality. They knew this intuitively, and they'd try to move toward the church, and then they'd face these things going off in their faces. So the ones who would read the Bible, again, depending on how strong the voices were, if they were strong, they would interfere with everything. They couldn't comprehend anything in the Bible. But if you gave them, and I saw this for myself, I tested it out. If you gave them a horror story and you asked them to read a few paragraphs from the horror story, they would remember everything there. So, what I did is got a series of positive spiritual paragraphs and a series of paragraphs from horror stories. And I would give them to the schizophrenics, and I'd say, read each of these, and after you read them, write down everything you remember about them. So I gave them the spiritual thing, gave them the pen, they wrote down. Gave them the horror story thing, pen, wrote down. They could remember 2 to 3 times the amount of material from the horror stuff as they could from the spiritual stuff. Very odd, and this was consistent. So prayers were another thing. Now, back to the Bible. And this was odd. If the patient insisted on reading the Bible and would not quit, the voices would say, okay, you have to read it from cover to cover. You can't just read it randomly or where you want. And then what would happen would be the patient would get to the sections where this guy begat that guy, begat that guy, begat that guy. I mean, these long pages and pages. And then the voices would come back and see, this is a bunch of crap. Look at this. What are you reading this for? This is garbage. Why are you doing this? Stop it. And they'd have them at that point. They would stop reading. So I found that the schizophrenics were attracted to all kinds of negative stuff, negative movies, horror films, anything that would feed that negativity. They would self-sabotage themselves. I mean, the voices would tell them, you don't have to complete your schoolwork. You don't have to show up for your doctor's appointment. And they would constantly fail at whatever they tried to do. And this was over and over and over. One of the first things I saw was the medications. I mean, here that they're giving them antipsychotic medications, which are bringing them back to what we would call somewhat normal reality. Because psychosis is horrible. It's absolutely hell on earth. It is awful. There's nothing short of a full-scale war and a horrible blood-covered battlefield that is worse than psychosis. So I watched time after time as patients would all of a sudden quit taking their medications. Matter of fact, I remember one time, the first time this came to my attention was I was walking through one psychiatric unit, and down on I remembered the top banister on the second floor of this psych unit was open. And for some reason, they were chopping off the bottom section of the banister. And I didn't know why, but I stopped and I was watching, along with a bunch of patients who were also standing there watching them chop off the bottom of this banister. And there were sparks flying all over, and it was like, yeah, this is cool. When that cap fell off that banister, thousands of pills came out of that banister like a friggin' slot machine. I mean, all colors. They were bouncing all over the floor. Hundreds of them. Patients had been throwing those pills on the top of that banister for who knows how long, decades. And here were thousands of them come pouring out. And I'm looking at these things, and most of them are antipsychotic drugs. And I'm like, why would they do that? Why would they throw away the drug that keeps them sane? And then I noticed that they were refusing and resisting taking those medications. They'd stay on them for a while, and then all of a sudden they'd start falling apart in class. I get a call from one of the instructors. I had to leave Yarborough, go over to one of the vocational classes, and here's the guy, psychotic and paranoid. Did you stop taking your meds? Oh, yeah, I stopped taking your meds. And I asked him, well, why'd you stop taking your meds? Virtually all of them said, well, the side effects are awful. Yeah, they are. The side effects are awful. But compared to psychosis, they're small potatoes. Compared to being in a psychotic state, they're nothing. They're bad. And I couldn't figure it. It didn't make any sense. Why would they be choosing absolute worst, the most horrible of these two choices? The side effects of the meds, which weren't good, granted, or the absolute hell of psychosis and becoming totally non-functional and crazy as a bat and sometimes dangerous and just totally out of it. Why were they choosing the worst of the two? And that's all I would get. Now, I'd ask all the staff, why are they doing that? Oh, well, they don't like the side effects. Oh, yeah, but, that doesn't make any sense. Well, they're crazy. That's all there is to it. That's one of the symptoms of their being crazy, that they don't take their meds. They're crazy. And I'm like, well, what kind of explanation is that? So, I asked all kinds of staff. I asked attendants. I asked psychiatrists. I asked psychologists. That was the basic thing. They're crazy. That's the symptom. They're crazy. So I'm like, well, what doesn't make any sense? And I came to the point where I the only way I'm going to find an answer to this is to ask the patients. So, I began asking the patients, why are you doing this? Why can't you? At one point, what I did was got a listing of all the negative side effects, or all the negative aspects of paranoid schizophrenia. So 2 pages of bad crap, of symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. Then I would ask the patient, I did this with scores of them. I'd ask the patient, okay, you write down all the negative side effects you've had from the medication you were taking, all of them. Here, I'm going to give you a blank piece of paper, write them all down. And they did. Now, not all of them had the same side effects, so I didn't want to give them anything, let them do it on their own. So that's what we were dealing with in each particular case, their particular side effects that they experienced. And then when they were done that, I handed them that list of psychiatric symptoms from paranoid schizophrenia, like 2 pages. So circle each one of these you experienced when you went off your bed. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, here's this circle, scores of them. I mean, awful stuff. And then I'd hand it back to them, and I'd say, which is worst? Well, yeah, the psychotic symptoms are worse. Well, then why do you keep going off your meds? I don't know. That went on for years. It must have went on for 2-3 years. And I felt like a nutcase beating my head against a brick wall. I mean, they say, you keep asking the same question over and over and over again and expect a different response. You're the one that's nuts. And that's exactly what I was doing. And not only that, I got in trouble with psychiatry. Don't be asking them about their hallucinations. Their hallucinations are just making them. By then, I already knew that there was something fishy about this, that they weren't just hallucinations. There were patterns to them, and they were well-defined and predictable patterns. So, one day, there was this one gal who went off her meds. She went psychotic, and her mother was concerned we were going to throw her out of the program because she'd done this before. So her mother called me and said, I'm coming up. I don't want you to throw her out of the program. I can't deal with her at home. I'll do everything I can. I'll be up Friday, and we'll talk to her together and see if we can't get her to take. So okay, fine. Finally a parent who's interested in her child. So I met them Friday afternoon. They came to my house, and both her and my mother are saying, "Why are you doing this? You've done this before. You're about ready to get thrown out of the program. Why did you do it again?" And she goes, "Oh, the side effects." And he said, "No, it's not the side effects. That doesn't make any sense." And her mother said, "Come on, tell us why did you do this? Why do you keep doing this?" And she said, "Okay, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but the voices told me not to take those medicines." And I said, "The voices told you to do that?" And she said, "Yeah, the voices told me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me. That these medications were poison." And then you go back to the assaults on psychiatrists that I just read. I read you those stats, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Now that explains why, here's the psychiatrist being attacked at a rate astronomically higher than any other doctor, equal with attendants that are spending 24 hours a day on the wards, and psychiatrists are getting attacked by these patients at such a horrendous rate. And here's a girl telling me the voices told me not to take the medications because I was being poisoned and the psychiatrist was poisoning me. Whoa. But then again, that was only one patient, and you can't go on just what one patient said. So then I started asking scores of others, why are you not taking your medications? Did the voices have anything to do with this? Did you believe the psychiatrist was poisoning you? And man, here it comes. Yeah, the psychiatrist was poisoning me. In some cases, they come straight out and say, yeah, the voices told me he was poisoning me. But in most cases, they said, these aren't good for you. Look at these side effects. And the voices would point to all the side effects, and they'd stop taking them, and they would go psychotic. That explained it. That friggin' explained it. The voices were behind this. It wasn't random. It wasn't because they're crazy. There was something telling them not to take these medications. If they took the medications, the voices would weaken. And the voices didn't want any part of them. So they would tell these patients to attack the psychiatrist.
Well, this is the very strange thing that came out in that first interview when I listened to it, this kind of strange codependency that exists. In other words, the voices are completely detrimental to the host, but the host gets dependent on the voices.
Well, depends on what you see as detrimental. Now, I've had, I don't know how many patients who were on drugs tell me that the voices would tell them where to go to get drugs. They saw that as a good thing. Matter of fact, there's one case that this one was so odd, but at the time this patient told me this story, he was sane. We had gotten rid of his voices. He was totally sane, and there were no voices left. He told me that he went psychotic on drugs, cocaine it was, and at the time he had like $250, and his voices told him, he was in San Diego, California. His voices said, listen, we know where there's a sesamilia pot field in Oregon. Take your $250, go and get 2 burlap sacks, and get in your car, and we'll show you where this sesamilia pot field is. You can sell the stuff and have a ball. So he listened to his voices, and there's story after story about them listening to voices and having actual incredible results. So he got in his car, drove to Oregon, and they're telling him turn by turn where to go. So they say, okay, turn up this dirt road. So he drives for like 23 miles up this dirt road in Oregon to the base of a mountain, and the dirt road ends. And he goes, okay, what do I do now? He said, well, get your 2 sacks, get your knife, and there's a hiking trail off to the left. Take that hiking trail and just keep following. So he followed that hiking trail up for like 3.5 hours, got up into this big open field, and it was just full of these sesamelia high-quality pot plants. And he started cutting them down, filled up the 2 burlap sacks, and he said, okay, what do I do now? The voices said, well, we know where there's a park where you can sell this stuff. And so they told him. They told him right where to go. And here he is selling that pot, making a fortune selling it in this park. And I said, well, what'd you do with all the money? He said, well, I had all the prostitutes I could handle. You know, I had all the liquor I wanted. I had all the cocaine I wanted. You know, and the voices were fishermen. They wanted to go fishing. And I said, what? They were fishermen? The voices wanted to go fishing? He said, yeah, they were fishermen. They wanted to go fishing. So we went out to the Columbia River, and I got all my fishing stuff. I got my alcohol, my cocaine, and I'm standing on the bank, and we're fishing, and the voices were telling me where to throw the hook and how long to leave it there and when to move on. He said, I was the only one catching fish on the river that day. Nobody else was catching fish. And I'm like, you made this up. And, no, I didn't make this up. This is a true story. You know? And I said, well, what happened? And he goes, well, for 2 weeks, I had all the prostitutes I could handle. I had all the whiskey I could handle. I had all the cocaine I could handle. I had pot. I had everything I wanted, you know, and I was fishing and having a great old time. And then I ran out of money, and I was about to go up to the pot field again and fill up the bags. And the voices said, no, they're up there waiting for you. If you go up there this time, they're going to kill you. They know somebody, you've been taking your pot. They're waiting for somebody, whoever's doing it. They're waiting in ambush to get you. Do not go up there. So the voices told him, take your money and go back down to San Diego. And he came back in San Diego with more money than he had to start with. Now, what was odd with this case is that his deceased mother would come through every once in a while we were struggling with his negative voices. And that was odd. Now, what I found as a rule of thumb is if a voice or an entity or spirit comes through and it says anything negative or derogatory, immediately I'm suspect that this entity is negative and that it's playing the part of a good spirit to kind of reel the guy in. So I'd ask him, well, what does your mother say? And he goes, well, she tells me stuff like, wear clean underwear and stay away from this guy and don't go near that guy and do good in school and, all the kind of stuff mothers would say. I said, well, does she ever tell you anything negative? And he goes, no, never. Well, that's odd. And I said, well, what happens, what does she do when the voices come? And he said, well, if they're the weak ones, she can chase them away. She said, if they're the strong ones, she runs because she's not strong enough to drive them off. So the mother was there all the way through this, and I'd ask, what's your mother telling you these days? Just checking to see if it was anything negative. No, it wasn't. There was one day where she said, well, you stay away from that prisoner. And, he was looking at a prisoner on the yard. And he said, well, okay, I'll stay away from him. Because she said, he's going to beat you up if you don't stay away from him. And so one day he's in the bathroom. He just took a shower and his hair's wet. And he's combing the hair back and whipping that water out of his hair. And this inmate that he was warned about walks through the door just as he whips his hair back, and the water goes flying off his head. The water hits this other prisoner in the face, and he attacks him. That actually happened. I'm like, whoa. So an odd thing that happened at the end is, I would check in, well, what's your mom telling you now? What's your mom? And it was all stuff like, wear a clean shirt, don't do anything stupid, stay away from these guys, quit taking drugs. And it's just all stuff mother would say. Once the voices disappeared, the mother was still there. I'd check in with this fellow and I said, well, he comes into my office one day and he goes, hey, my mom wants to talk to you. I said, your mom wants to talk to me directly? He goes, yeah. And I said, well, have a seat. What's she got to say? and he says, she wants to thank you for she said, thank you for helping my son. He repeated this, her. And I'm like, wow, man. I'm getting goosebumps just talking about this. And I said, you're most welcome. Your son did a good job of following through with what he was told to do, and I was just a catalyst. And I asked her, I said, well, what are you doing up there? She goes, well, I'm checking people in. I'm the secretary. I said, whoa. And I went to ask her another question, and her response was, everything you need to know is in the Bible. She said, I'm not supposed to be talking to you. And that was the end of it. And this guy had recovered, and he never went psychotic again. He stopped using drugs. He was cured.
This is incredible. How did you get the patients to trust you, to talk to you about voices?
That took years to learn how to do that. The bottom line is there is no positive outcome for paranoid schizophrenics to talk about their voices to anybody. You look at what happens. They talk to their friends. Hey, man, I'm hearing these awful voices. They're telling me these horrible things. They're telling me to do these rotten things. They're telling me I'm no good. What is their friend going to think? Like, hey, man, there's something bad wrong with this person. They're possessed or something. They're weird, and it's scary, and they back away. So they lose their friends, and then they go talk to their parents. Hey, man, I'm hearing voices, and they're not telling me good things. And well, that's scary. Something's wrong with you. We need to take you to a psychiatrist. So, okay, they drag him into the psychiatrist's office, and psychiatrist, well, what's going on with you? Well, I'm hearing voices. Well, what are they? They're bad. You can't sleep. They're bad. I can't sleep. I'm hearing them. I get upset. They get stronger, and I don't know what to do. Oh, well, you're psychotic. We're going to have to put you on meds. So, here comes the heavy duty, major tranquilizers, and they turn the person into a freaking zombie. And then the patient saying, well, wait a minute, these aren't hallucinations, these are real. No, you're hallucinating. They're not real. I'm the doctor. It's due to a chemical brain imbalance in your brain. You need to take these medicines, and there is no cure, and you have to take them for the rest of your life, and you have to take them every day. And they make the patient feel like crap. I mean, it's like pouring sludge on your brain. I mean, they're not good things, but they do keep the person somewhat sane, and they reduce the strength and the frequency of the voices. But
yeah, I think it'd be a really good point, Jerry, to bring in that story where you realised that this was something much bigger than just something going on within the prisoner. When you had that psychotic patient and you went into the room and you realised there was phenomena happening around the patient.
Oh yeah, that was this one guy was. The prison was a perfect place to work with these people. I mean, they were criminally insane, and the prison was always in an uproar. I mean, there was always somebody assaulting somebody. There was, it was in a constant negative uproar. It's like hell on earth. So a psychotic patient complaining about me setting him off by asking him about his voices wasn't even background noise there. Where on a psych ward in a private hospital or in the state hospital, if a patient complained that I was upsetting them because I was asking them about their voices, that was a big thing. It was like an unwritten law in private and state hospitals. You do not upset a psychotic patient for any reason, because you never know what they're going to do. Look at the assault rate on psychiatrists. I mean, you can't ever really predict what they're going to do. So I think there was this level of fear about upsetting them because you never knew how strongly they were going to react or how violently they were going to react. So you just don't upset them. That's the ground rule. You don't upset them. You just kind of tiptoe around them and don't be asking them nothing that upsets them, and just, handle them with kid gloves and walk on eggshells. I wasn't about to do that, so I got myself in a lot of trouble a lot of times, ordered by psychiatrists several times not to be asking them questions about their voices, because all it does is upsets them. It reinforces their hallucinations, and it makes them worse. It doesn't make them any worse, you know. It'll make them agitated. It'll set them off sometime if you're not careful. So I had to know how far to push them without setting them off, and I was pretty good at that. Every once in a while I stepped over and got in trouble. But the prison was a perfect place to be studying these voices, because even if they did go off, like I said, I mean, the psychotic prisoner complaining about the psychologist upsetting him, that's not even going to be on 0 on the Richter scale compared to some of the stuff that goes on in there, you know. So I was able to, what I did is surrounded myself with a group of criminally psychotic patients who were willing to tell me everything about their voices, irrespective of how bad their voices beat them up for doing so. And I don't know how many times while I was talking to one of these guys, the voices would come out and say, don't tell him anything else. He already knows too much. Shut up. I mean, that happened over and over and over again. And I'm like, what the hell kind of hallucination would say something like that? And,
well, I think we're just getting down to the real meat and potatoes of it now, in that this is not what we're being told. And I suspected this for a very long time. And hearing what you had to say reconfirmed that to me, because I've seen this in people. I've studied schizophrenics. I've known people who develop this totally enigmatic illness, and there is something else in there. Something takes them over. I've always thought this, and I know I relate some experiences I had with you, were very personal to me, about someone that I knew and these psychotic episodes and the actual symptoms of it. And it's a very, very frightening illness, because we are talking about people, whether people believe this or not, but people do become possessed.
Yes.
And these psychotic episodes are like nothing you can possibly imagine. They are not like, for people who don't know about this, they're not like normal anger. They're beyond anything. And I think you should carry on anyway, Jerry, because we're coming up to a break now. Yeah, we're coming up to a break now. Would you like to tell us this story before the break? We've got about 3 minutes.
I think I can do it in 3 minutes.
Right, okay.
In the prison, I watched psychotic inmates become supernaturally strong. I mean, they would bounce, 100-pound psychotic would bounce 3 big guards around the inside of the cell like popcorn. But there was one in particular that was unbelievable. This took place in the Florence prison. This big psychotic guy, 175 pounds of muscle, locked in the cell, like hearing voices all the time. They wanted to move him to another cell. He would not come out of it. And the guards, being what they are, you know, hey, we're macho, you will come out, we're going to make you come out. Instead of just shutting off his water until he came out, they're going to make him come out. So they say, you either come out of there or we're going to get the pepper spray and we're going to douse you with it. So they had these like quart canisters of pepper spray. And they said, okay, come out, you know, cuff up, come out, or we're going to let you have this. He goes, you know, screw you, I'm not coming out, I'm not doing anything. You know, so they started spraying him. He put a towel around his face, and they just saturated the inside of that cell with this pepper spray. And that stuff is nauseous. It's, you know, it's awful. I mean, you get anywhere near it, the guards' eyes were watering. They were suffering, you know, from spraying the stuff very much. And this guy took that off, and his face was all flushed and red. You know, and he's just standing there, you know, kind of going, screw you. And I'm not coming out. You come in and get me. You know, at that point, nobody was going to try to go in there. And so they said, you come out, or we're going to go get the stun guns. And it's 50,000 volts. It's these little darts that shoot in with a wire, and they stick in the prisoner, and then they start putting in the electricity. 50,000 volts. That's enough to knock down any prisoner I've ever seen. Even the biggest ones would go down with a 50,000 volt charge. They put 2 of these things in this guy. They shot him twice, and one of them is discharging, and this prisoner just standing there shivering, just shaking, you know, all over the place. And just, you could tell he was being electrocuted. When one discharged and was recharging, the second one was firing. So they did this 11 times, one after the other after the other. It would be enough to kill most people. And this guy just standing there shivering, you know. And then the warden comes down and goes, yeah, I think you better stop it. I'm going to get fired for cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, so they stopped that. And then they said, okay, you come on out now. And the guy, screw you, come in and get me, you bunch of sissy asses. And started cussing them, a bunch of wimps and fags. He was hitting them with all the stuff that, kind of all demeaning stuff. They said, you come out of there, we're going to go get the dog. Now, the attack dogs, the prisoners are terrified of the attack dogs. I mean, those things, they will rip you to pieces. So they went and got the attack dog, and they said, now come out or we're sending in the dog after you. So he goes, screw you. You come in and get me. So they opened the cell wide enough for that dog to leap in there. The prisoner was sitting on his bed. He throws his forearm up in front of his face. The dog latches onto his wrist and bites all the way down to the bone and will not let go. And the guy pulls the dog with his arm up to eye level, looks the dog straight in the eye and says, sit. And the dog sits, but he won't let go of his arm. And the dog's sitting there with blood gushing out of the guy's wrist. And the prisoner looks up at the guards and goes, come and get me. they were going to go in there. So by then they had 30 guards out there, and the dog wouldn't let go, and they pulled on the rope, and the dog kind of pulled the prisoner out of the cell. And once he was out, they beat the crap out of him. But, you talk about supernatural strength. I mean, once they get angry, there's energy that comes in from another source that is just unworldly. And I spoke to what do you call those guys? A devil worshiper once. In the
Satanist. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, he was spooky. He was one of the spookiest I've ever spoke to, and he talked about where that energy comes from. I guess it's about time for a break now, though.
Yeah, it's pretty heavy going for people, but very, very interesting. I mean, this stuff is fascinating because I hope that's given people a bit more insight into what this thing's about. We're talking about something that they're trying to get people just to take these psychotropic chemical kosh drugs to basically blank out something that is very, very serious. And it's not just something that's a chemical imbalance. That's the most important thing. This is something else, and it goes back into ancient times. We've talked about it. We've talked about possession. We've talked about this kind of whole. It's a massive part of our history, demonic possession and spirits and people being attacked by these energies and these forces. And even to a small extent, everybody knows about this stuff because people, for instance, know when they're being stared at. People know when there's malevolent intention towards them. People really know when they're being psychic attacks, when they're being psychically attacked. So, in other words, this is part of a very big picture, and it is a spiritual battle, and we'll come back to that in part 2.
That's exactly what it is.
Windows on the World live every Sunday, 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Join me, Mark Windows, and Tony Hurst. Join the conversation in our chat box, and also catch up with life-changing information on our continuous program stream at windowsontheworld.net. I
had a very interesting first half there, and some of those stories should really start resonating with people, I think, because we're getting to what this is really about. What it is about is looking at the whole idea of our reality and what we've been conditioned into thinking it is, because there is a battle. There's the state are trying to make us completely godless, and they're making us completely compliant. They want biological machines. That's really what this whole thing's about. It's about the actual dumbing down. And we talk about this all the time, don't we, Tony? The complete dumbing down of everything.
Yep.
That's right. That's right on. That is right on. Look what they're doing. The television, you turn on the television, nothing but drug commercials. Take this, take that, and the population is being dumbed down.
Oh, in every way. And television is actually a weapon against the people because that actually stops people thinking, and it cuts down any kind of critical analysis of what's going on. And this is all part of it. And we have this thing now called the post-truth world. And this came out of British Psychological Association. They produced a paper, Could Psychology Be an Answer to the Post-Truth World? And of course, no, it can't, because it's not based on truth. And this whole narrative we're getting is totally strange, because once you pull yourself away from it and you look at it objectively, people are living in a childlike reality. But it's actually, above all that, is this authoritarian, remote kind of dictatorship that is in everybody. Yes. The pressure around the actual way this is being imposed in every part of their lives. But we've got to get back to you, Jerry, with what you were saying.
Yeah, a big part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Psychiatry and psychology, the two kind of mix together. But I think you should carry on now with some more of your anecdotes. What you were talking about in the break was also the way that methamphetamine, cocaine, and these sort of stimulant drugs are a gateway into these mental illnesses such as schizophrenia.
Yes, and Tony he was interested in that too, so I'm going to move off in that direction.
Yeah.
The first time I became aware of, I was out of the prison working as a contractor for the prison at the time the amphetamine push hit. So here's all these prisoners coming in, psychotic, from amphetamine. I didn't know amphetamine could make you psychotic, and they started talking about seeing the shadow people. So right away I'm like, well, what are the shadow people? Well, they tell me, well, they're these three-dimensional shadows with no faces. They're darker than the rest of the room. They walk through walls. They sit in the trees. They call them the tree people. And I talked to one guy, and I said, oh, well, that's odd. So I never took one or two, inmates' word for anything, because they are psychotic and they're not known for being truthful. So you kind of got to check it out with a bunch of different ones that don't know each other and see if the stories coincide. So I started talking to the amphetamine prisoners who came in. And every time I found one was using amphetamine, I went, well, you ever seen the shadow people? Oh, yeah, I've seen the shadow people lots of times. You ever see their eyes? There were two levels there. If they didn't see their eyes, they weren't really intensive users. They were probably starting off, they were in the first phase, but they were in trouble. If they saw their eyes, and I actually used this as a clinical diagnostic. If they saw their eyes, they were in much worse shape than if they didn't. Right? So if they didn't see their eyes, the guy was, he's bad, but he's not as bad as he could be. If they saw their eyes, they're in serious trouble. And I'd ask them, well, what color are their eyes? Consistently, they said lime green or red. And neither one of those colors for eyes struck me as something positive. And they would tell the same stories. They'd say they walk through walls, they appear at night, they're darker than the rest of the room, they come and go. When you turn on the light, they disappear. Sometimes they wear hats, which I thought was strange. They come in with capes. They blur past. They come and go. If you look at them, they start moving in on you. And I found that pretty strange. And they all said the same thing. If you stare at them, they know you're watching them, and they start coming toward you. And at that point, most of them went, well, this isn't good. I don't want whatever this thing is coming toward me. So they turn away and they stop paying attention, unless they're in the bedroom at night. That's why a lot of these guys sleep with their lights on, because they can't see them when the lights fall on. They disappear. And then there was one time where, now this was fascinating to me because I'd never known any prisoner to experiment with these things. And this prisoner told me that he and a friend were injecting amphetamine. They were seeing these shadow people, and they were wondering what they were and if they both saw the same ones. So what they did is they took off at night to the Sells Indian Reservation south of here, went down this isolated dirt road on the reservation in the middle of nowhere, brought their amphetamine. One of them shot up and waited. The other guy stayed straight. And then the one who shot up started seeing the shadow people. So he started going, wait, there's one over there. You see him? No, I don't see him. Well, there's another one right next to you. You see him? No, I don't see him. And so after a series of questions, they realized that they needed the meth to see these shadow people. That somehow it sped up their system to where they could see this particular vibration. So the second one shot up, and then they started comparing. You see that one over there? Yeah, I see him. What's he doing? He's doing this. Oh, how about that one over there? Yeah, he's moving to the right. So they came to the realization that they were both seeing the same thing. You know, it wasn't like an independent hallucination. They verified with each other that what they were seeing was the same. You know? So they kept watching these things, and all of a sudden, then slowly,
especially amphetamine-based ones. I do know a little bit about that, and that psychosis.
Yeah. Now, psychotics also see these things too. You know, they see the shadow people, but the meth heads, you know, in this case, the shadow people circled them. They were in this truck. They came out of the desert and they circled them, and they were moving in on them because they were watching and pointing at these things. And they kept coming closer and closer, and these two guys freaked out. They jumped in the truck, locked the doors, and they were watching them from inside the truck. So I said, well, what happened? He said, all of a sudden the back of the truck recoiled like there was a giant boulder hit the back of the truck, and the front end jumped up. And I said, what was that all about? He said, well, the whole back of the truck was filled with these shadow people. And man, that made the hair on my back stand up, because they were, if that was true, they were affecting physical reality, which I didn't think they could do. You know, I thought they were just kind of like ghosts or something like that. But if they could make the back of the truck recoil and the front of it jump up, there's a little bit more to this than that. And it kind of shook me up a little. And I said, well, what did you do after that? And they said, well, we drove off like a bat out of hell, almost wrecked the truck. And I asked him, well, did they follow you? And he said, no. You know? So that kind of spooked me a little bit. You know? And then one day I was telling Tony, I was working in one of the large hospitals in the ER, and I'd been assigned to the Christmas Eve shift, which I hated. So I'm in the psych annex waiting for, you know, psychotic or whatever the police drive in to evaluate and figure out what we're going to do with. And this fella comes in from the ER into the psych annex, and he is shaking like a baby. He just cannot stop shaking. I bring him to the office, and you know, I'm like, hey, what's going on, man? Well, I've been using amphetamine. I've been using a lot of it. Well, for how long? Well, I've been injecting for 10 years. I'm like, what? You know, I said, you should have been dead by now. 10 years? He goes, yeah, 10 years. Well, do you ever see the shadow people? Oh, yeah, I see the shadow people all the time. You see their eyes? Yeah, I see their eyes. What color? You know, red or lime green. You know? And then something, I figured, you know, this guy's been at it for a long time. Never had any of them that I talked to said that they could hear what the shadow people were saying. They were talking. They said they don't talk. So I asked this guy, I said, you ever heard him talk? And he said, yeah, I've heard him talk. And I went, wow, man. So, well, what did they sound like? And he said, well, he made this high-pitched squeal that kind of sent shivers up my back when he tried to mimic, you know, the voice tone of this thing. And, you know, and I said, well, what did they say to you? And he said, well, they told me to jump in front of traffic and that I wouldn't get hurt. So I said, well, what'd you do? He said, well, I went and I jumped in front of the car and got hit and got knocked to the side of the road, and I was laying in the gutter. I said, well, what happened then? He said, well, shadow people were all around me, and they said, get up, you're not hurt. And he said he got up and he wasn't hurt. He said he did this twice and he wasn't hurt. And you know, just when he said that, all of a sudden he stopped shaking and his eyes got black, wide black. And there was something looking through those eyes that wasn't human. It was like this cold hatred, you know, that, you know, the feeling I got was, I'd rather cut your guts out and spread them all over the room than say another word to you. You know, it was like you know, one thing I learned is you can't show fear. You cannot show fear. So I'm staring at this guy, looking in those eyes, and they were not human. It was spooky. It was just like they went down fathoms of just dark hatred. And then he stopped. He stopped shaking. He was just still, dead still while this happened. And then a second later, he started shaking again.
Wow.
And, I'm like, whoa, that was spooky. And even though it was maybe 10 seconds that stare lasted, it felt like an eternity, And then I asked him another question. I forgot what it was. He answered it. And then that thing came back again, and stared at me again. And it was like, I don't know if I can take this anymore. But, you can't show fear. You have to, it's like a dog. If you turn around and attack.
Yeah.
So, after that next question, I can't deal with this guy anymore. The psych nurse had to do her evaluation. She only could deal with this guy for 30 seconds. She'd come run into my office and go, what did you find? I can't deal with this guy. So yeah, the shadow people are part of it.
Yeah, they sound pretty scary. The other thing that strikes me is all this supernatural strength. I mean, I first heard stories about this in the papers, but way back in the 1980s when they used to report on James Brown and his PCP indulgements and what he used to do to the police on those occasions and that. And apparently he had the strength of 10 men or something. So
just use the video of the girls, the twins in Sweden that were running in front of traffic and getting hit by trucks, right? Didn't you see that video?
Yep,
I've
seen it.
Yes.
Two psychotic twins. And man, they were being hit by trucks and bouncing off them like nothing. I mean, it was unbelievable.
Was that the BBC Motorway Cops one?
It was called a friend of mine made a film, Dave McCann, called A Madness Shared by Two. And
Yes, that's it.
they were under observation by the police and they kept getting let go. This is why he thinks that they were allowed to get away from the police so much and they ended up on that motorway. But it is actually fascinating just to look at that footage because, they're getting hit full on by trucks and they're just getting up and walking off. And is this something to do with the actual drug they're on, or is it something else? Because you're talking about superhuman strength and these altered states of consciousness. Yeah.
This is what I'm trying to get at. Can I just have a little bit? Because with these different types of drugs, there seems to be a common element in some of them that's having a certain effect on a certain part of the brain. And one of the questions I was wondering earlier is there any scans that show changes in the brain of these people once they've long-term used these drugs and they're fully opened up to whatever it is that they're experiencing?
I don't know the answer to that.
Whenever they've tried to find patterns in the brain or any kind of scans, it doesn't work, does it?
They're able to find anything afterward. Now, while they're under the influence of the drug, I think they do. But those scans can't pick up possession. They've been trying to find some chemical marker for schizophrenics forever. They can't find anything. They don't have any evidence for a chemical imbalance. None. Zero. But yet they're selling all these drugs based on there being a chemical imbalance in their brain. It's a scam. Now, that's not to say the drugs don't work. They work to suppress the symptoms, but that's all they do. They don't cure anything. And, that's a perfect drug to rip off the populace with, a drug that only temporarily suppresses the symptoms, doesn't cure anything. The patient has to take it to maintain sanity, and they can charge, I think one of the antipsychotics here was $750 for a month's supply. Most people can't afford that.
It's crazy, isn't it? I mean, psychotropic drugs can't medicate something which is not there if they can't actually see that it's there. And this is the big point, isn't it? That we're talking about something that is not tangible. And this is, I suppose, the entree into it for people who can't get their heads around this idea of possession and all the rest of it, is that we're talking about something intangible here. Nobody really knows what it's about. these diagnoses of mental illness. I think maybe you should go into that, Jerry, the kind of very woolly diagnoses and basically the absolutely kind of clueless way they go about it, but they do it under jargon, don't they?
Well, you know, one of the things that struck me as very strange to start with is they say, oh yeah, it's a chemical imbalance. But I have never seen them give a lab test to find out what that imbalance was or how much of an imbalance there was. You know, that struck me as strange to start with when I started at the state hospital. Here they all the psychiatrists saying, yeah, it's a chemical imbalance in the brain. You know, but then I go, well, which chemicals are out of balance and by how much? You know, how do you know? Well, we just know. Do you have any lab tests? No, we don't have any lab tests. We just know. You know, I mean, well, how do you know? You know, well, you know, it takes years of studying psychiatry to answer that kind of question. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. You know, and you look at the way they dealt with these guys. Here they're filling them full of different chemicals. I mean, each one of those antipsychotic drugs are radically different chemicals from each other, and they all have the same effect. And that effect is to sedate or tranquilize the patient. So if it's a chemical imbalance, what are all these different chemicals having the same effect? You know, they say, oh yeah, there's a 1-to-1 correlation between these chemicals and a blockage of dopamine receptors or something like that. Oh yeah, they're concentrating on that. What they're completely ignoring is that there's also a 1-to-1 correlation between sedating and tranquilizing these patients and the amelioration of psychotic symptoms. They won't even look at that. It's a 1-to-1 correlation. You calm these guys down, the psychotic symptoms start to rebate. They start dropping off. You know, they totally ignore that. And that happens because these entities want negative emotional energy. That's why they're filling these people's head with all this crap. It's all negative. You're no good. You're rotten. You're a scum. Nobody likes you. You know, you're a burden on everybody. I mean, there's a list on Sherry's website of 50 of these most common awful things that these things say to people. They're all negative, derogatory, demeaning, they're all aimed at generating negative emotional energy in the patient. Now, once that happens, and now this is a marker that if psychiatry would open their friggin' eyes, they would see it. Is that every time these patients are attacked by the voices, after those voices leave, those patients are drained of energy. They don't have any energy. Some of them are so drained they can't even get out of bed to eat breakfast. And they will tell you this. And I did a statistical analysis of this once. Is 2 sheets of paper, 1 to 10 scale. How much energy do you feel you have before the voices attack? You know, draw a circle, 1 to 10. How much energy do you feel that you have after the voices attack and leave? 1 to 10. Consistently, it was markedly less energy. I ran an analysis of variance on it when I knew how to do that stuff, and it was statistically significant. And you ask them, where does that energy go? Oh, I don't know. I don't know where it goes. You know, and for years I thought I saw that energy, but I thought it was due to the anxiety created by these voices attacking at night and saying these horrible things and nightmares, and you know, that's a lot of anxiety. One day, I always got assigned to the nastiest, most dangerous units at the prison, and I was kind of an adrenaline junkie, so I kind of didn't complain about it. One day, I got assigned to the jail for the prison, which is, you know, the worst of the entire prison is sent to this jail. I mean, the worst of the worst is in there. So one day I got a call from the captain of that unit, what do they call it, the CDU, Central Detention Unit. And he said, well, we got a prisoner here who the inmates, he snitched off a big drug deal. We're doing a drug deal. He told the cops busted the deal, you know, took all the drugs, sent a bunch of the gangsters to different prisons, and really, really pissed off the gangsters. And they were trying to kill him. They wanted him dead so bad that they got into trouble so they could get thrown into the central detention unit so they would at least have a chance of trying to kill this guy. You know, they'd already stabbed him once and didn't kill him, you know, and they were shooting these messages under his door. You know, they have these strings that they can throw with a message on it that shoot across the entire floor so fast you can't believe it, and go into the next cell with a message, and then they reel that thing back in. I mean, it's amazing how they do it. I had no idea how they do it, but they're good at it. You know, and they were sending him all these notes. You know, you come out of there, you're dead, man. We're waiting to get you. You know, he could not come out of that cell without a guard taking him anywhere. That's how much danger it is. And you couldn't be in any more anxious than that. On top of that, his cellmate was a flaming, florid psychotic. I mean, this guy was hearing voices all the time. He was unstable, and this other fellow would wake up, and here's a psychotic guy standing over him in the dark, staring down at him in the dark. I mean, you can't get under much more stress than that, because you never know what that guy's going to do, that psychotic guy. So he sent me an inmate letter that said, hey, you have to help me. I got to get out of here. At the same time, the captain of the central detention unit sent me another letter saying, you have to do something about this psychotic guy who's driving his roommate nuts. So I went down there. They were both in the same cell. You couldn't have a better experimental situation. I mean, they were under the same roof. They were eating the same food. They were being fed at the same time. You know, they lived in the same place under the same circumstances. I mean, it was just perfect experimental situation. So, you know, I talked to them both one after the other. And, the psychotic guy was, first I talked to the guy that the inmates were trying to kill, and watched as he ascended the steps up the unit to come to the interview room. He looked like Superman compared to the psychotic guy. You know, and in his interview, he had plenty of energy. He was nervous. He was anxious. He had a lot of energy, you know, and told him I'd do what I could to get him out of there. And then interviewed the psychotic guy. The psychotic guy had so little energy. He could barely make it up those steps. I mean, he was slumped down in his chair. He could barely move. You know, he had no energy. And I said, well, your energy disappear after the voices come? He goes, yeah. You know where it goes? No, I have no idea. At that point,
it's amazing, some of these recollections.
It wasn't the anxiety.
Yeah.
At that point, I knew without a doubt it wasn't the anxiety.
Yeah.
So I think I told you about that other thing. So one of the prisoners I was working with, who was telling me, you know, he was one of the ones that was making good progress and telling me, you know, everything his voices said. I had I forgot what book. It was from a shaman who said that it was these entities actually fed off of the negative emotional energy of the people that they infested. So I figured I'd bring this book, and read that chapter, that paragraph, to one of the psychotic guys I've been working with for a long time. And I trusted this guy, and he was honest with me. So I started reading this to him, and he went into this stare like a zombie. He just stopped, and he's staring at me with this odd look on his face, you know, like he wasn't there anymore. And I looked at him, and then all of a sudden my office wall started crackling like an electric arc welder. In back of me, it started right behind me, and it started moving up the wall to my right at a 45-degree angle toward the ceiling. But I couldn't see anything. I could hear it clear as a bell. It sounded just like an arc welder. It was loud. It was this electrical crackling, and it was moving up the wall. And this guy's just staring at me. And I'm like, what is going on here? You know, and I was startled. I was like, whoa, whoa. And I went, I looked at that, and I was afraid to take my eyes off him for too long, because I didn't know what he was going to do. I was thinking he's probably going to attack me. So I pushed my office chair against the wall just in case he did, so I could kick him back. And they always had a female officer over the medical unit. She would have been useless. I mean, I was basically on my own. But I was afraid to take my eyes off him for any length of time, so I'm back and forth, staring at where this noise is, and then looking back at him and back and forth, back and forth. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't smell anything. Then it cut across over him at the ceiling, right at the joint of the room, the back of the room, right over his head. Crack, 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 just like electrical arc welder. And he's still staring at me with this odd zombie-like stare. He was just stark still. And then it starts coming down the wall to my left, crack, 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 and goes right into a Rubbermaid trash can on my left leg. And I'm looking down in there, and it had been cleaned by the inmate porter the night before. There's nothing there. And it's crackling in the trash can. I'm like, what the hell is going on? And then it just goes dead. And I look at him, and I ask him, do you hear that? Did you hear that? And he's just staring at me. He didn't respond at all. He's just got this eerie stare. And he's just looking at me. And I'm like, what in the hell is going on? And then he gets up very rigid, almost like a robot. He goes, I gotta go. And I'm like, thank God, get the hell out of here. Oh, go now, kid. And so he shuffles out the door and he goes down the hallway. And I'm like sitting there stunned. It's like, did I just hear what I thought I heard? Did that happen? And so I leave the office, and I'm looking all around the office first to see what could have caused this. There's nothing in that office that could have caused it. Nothing. So I go down the hall, and I check the other office doors. They're all locked and closed. None of the nurses are in yet. The doctors aren't in. They're all empty. There's nothing in that hall that could have caused that. I was freaked out of my skull. I was like, they can. It was like that's another affirmation that they can affect physical reality. I mean, I heard that. I heard it. It wasn't a hallucination. I heard it. So
I think people be absolutely amazed by this stuff, Jerry, because it's not something that I'd ever heard talked about in the depth that you go into it. And what, again, I have to keep reiterating is, why has nobody else in the profession picked up on this? There's a pattern here, that there's a characteristic to the voices, and they can manifest themselves outside the actual victim or the host.
First of all, you got to threaten them for something like that to happen. Okay, so if you believe they're hallucinations, like psychiatry says, they're free to operate the way they want. You're not interfering with them. You don't know what they are. They're a hallucination. In fact, psychiatry is saying they don't exist. They're not real. So they think they know the answer, so they're not looking. And the ivory tower is up there teaching all these psychiatrists who come out of there like they're gods, oh, these are hallucinations. This is what the ivory tower says they are. Would the ivory tower ever lie to us? No, they're hallucinations. That's what they are. That's what they've always been taught they were. And you don't question your professors. I've got in trouble for that a bunch of times. Questioning, especially in the doctoral program. You do not question a professor. That's the quickest way to get in trouble, is to cast doubt on what he's saying. And I was in trouble there too. So if you think you know the answer to something, you're not looking for an answer. You already got it.
Yeah, so in other words, we've kind of devolved. We were talking about this last week. The way we actually look at things is devolving. It's not evolving. So in other words, the people in the Middle Ages who called this out for being demonic possession or some kind of spirit possession were more accurate than the whole industry of psychiatry, because that's what it is. It's an industry, isn't it?
Yeah, it is an industry. Not to say that those drugs don't work, but the body and the mind are they're created perfect, and you start throwing those drugs in there, and you're screwing things up. Let me finish the end of that story because it's spooky. That inmate, I was so shook up after that I didn't call that guy back. I mean, after he left, I kind of closed my office and I didn't see anybody the rest of the day. I was so shook up. It was 2 months before I had got the guts to call that guy back in. And I put out a pass for him. He comes in and he looks good. I thought he would be a mess. I thought the voices would just beat the crap out of him and he would just be an absolute mess. No, he surprised me. He came in, he goes, hey, I've been doing some of the stuff you said. The voices are getting less and less, but he'd warned me earlier before this ever happened that what I was doing was dangerous, and I didn't know. I thought whatever these things were, they were in the head of the psychotic and they couldn't come out. Well, this was a different story when I heard this myself. So after some small talk, I asked him, I said, did you hear that crackling when you were in my office last time? He goes, yeah, I did, but I was surprised you did. And I said, what was that? And he said, that was them. I said, the voices? He goes, yeah, that was them. And I said, what were they trying to do? He said, they were trying to scare you off. And I said, oh, God, they did a damn good job of it, And I said, and he was real sociable. I mean, I thought he'd be a mess. He wasn't. I said, what were they telling you as you left the office looking like a zombie? He said, they were telling me to go get a shank and stick it in your belly. Shank is a homemade prison knife. And I said, well, why didn't you do it? He said, I couldn't find one and nobody would give me one. And I'm like, whoa. That was spooky. That was very spooky.
It certainly is. And your experiences are absolutely amazing for people to hear. I was so blown out with this stuff when I first heard it, and I hope everyone else is. But yeah, we were talking really along the lines of that this is a sort of spiritual battle that we're in generally, because in other words, what we're actually being fed through our media and all the rest of it is pretty demonic too. When you talk about negativity, this is what we get bombarded with, isn't it? We're bombarded with negativity. The whole war on terror narrative, the whole terror narrative, it's all about terror. It's all about trauma. And it's all about a kind of doom-laden narrative, which is given us all the time. And we're meant to be thankful for our little bit of safety in the middle of it all. And we're meant to be thankful that that's our lot. And we talked about this last week, the way we've been dumbed down, the way we accept so little. And the whole point with this, if you actually talk about it to a lot of people, they will, through fear or ignorance, not even want to know. And this means to me that we are devolving. In fact, when we talk about this stuff, and the Middle Ages, when they did talk about it for what it was, demonic possession, and they actually did refer to it as that. And when you go back into the Bible and the Watchers, the Nephilim, we were talking about this last week, that these offspring of the gods who came down and wrongly started breeding with earthlings, left these awful spirits here. And these were meant to be really powerful demons, but there were demons here before that, and there were spirits here before that. But apparently these ones were like, these were monster demons that were just left on the planet. And once you start looking into this stuff, it starts to make sense. It doesn't become something in your mind that's far-fetched. It actually starts to make much more sense than the narrative. And I hope this is starting to make sense to people out there, that these diagnoses of these mental illnesses, schizophrenia, as we've been talking about, is not what we're led to believe it is. It's something completely different. And your experiences over your lifetime, which is a really long career. I mean, you've been doing this. How many years were you a psychiatrist, Jerry?
Well, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a licensed psychotherapist right now.
Yes, you were in the field of psychiatry. Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I've worked with psychiatrists every day for years. If I was nuts, they would have had me locked up a long time ago. And I'll tell you, if I was working right now, I wouldn't dare say anything about, like I said here. It would be an interview like with Robert Stanley, where I would go incognito, because boy, they would not tolerate this very well at all. They're not going to like it anyway. But carrying your stream of thought a little further, you look around and you see what the television is telling you. All this negative crap, horror shows, negative news. The world is a mess. Everything is horrible. Everything's fearful. Trust your government. They'll protect you. Constant wars, constant battles, constant inundation with horror and terror and war, and you're constantly being fed this. Now, what effect does that have on your mind? It generates fear. Right? And what do these things feed off of? They feed off of fear. Now, you might think, oh yeah, well, poor schizophrenics. They're the only ones affected by. No, they're not the only ones affected by these things. How they operate is extremely clear in schizophrenics. I mean, it's very clear if you can get them to talk to you and see these patterns. But they affect us all, every single one of us, to different degrees. When you get a compulsive negative thought that you can't get rid of, that's them. Where do you think thoughts come from? You're walking down the sidewalk and all of a sudden you have this horrible thought about doing some awful thing that is not you. Where did that come from?
I think most people can relate to that because these are really, they're like impulses really. And that's something we were talking about just before the show. It's once you start examining this stuff, you have to realize, I think, that at the back of it all is this consciousness. We've got this conscious awareness that everything has, this field, this unified field. And that field can be interrupted by many things. And all this is an interruption of that field, isn't it, really?
Well, it's not only an interruption of it, it's a reprogramming of it. So if you look at what's really going on, it's your feelings that drive your consciousness. I mean, the strongest man can be brought to his knees crying and blubbering by feelings, where thoughts, I mean, they're not going to affect him. It's feelings that create reality. If you feel something, your thoughts will follow suit, and physical reality will change according to feeling. Right? Now, if you're schizophrenic, right, and these things have taken over, the feelings are awful. Right? So you're creating, or those feelings are creating, a awful negative reality that is generating a massive amount of negative emotional energy for these things to feed off of. It's your feelings that create. So they hijack the feelings. Once the feelings create a nightmare reality, then it becomes a self-perpetuating, whirlpool, where you just keep sinking deeper and deeper and deeper. And same thing with compulsive thoughts. So it's not just, okay, this person's schizophrenic. We're all schizophrenic to different degrees, if you want to look at it that way. It's a disordering of thought and feeling. And you get a compulsive thought that just comes into your head, and it's a bad one, that it's like, and then you start remunerating over it. Where do you think that thought comes from? Emanuel Swedenborg 700 years ago said, no thought belongs to you. These thoughts come in from outside of you. You are the chooser. You are the one who chooses whether you want to concentrate and feed energy into a negative thought and feeling, or if you want to concentrate and feed energy into a positive thought and feeling. You will move in the direction where you make that choice. You are the chooser. Now, what these negative entities do is try to take away that free will, and they give you their mind. So these voices are actually them in the person's mind, telling him to do this and do that and attack these psychiatrists and run into traffic and do all these horrific things. It is no longer the person anymore. I remember one female I was working with where the voices came out and went, she's ours. Don't waste your effort. She's ours. Get away. Very clearly.
Now, before we close, it would be really nice to go into how you can deal with this. In other words, how this can be interrupted. And you've had quite a lot of success with this. We're going to have to go into this in another show, but just to round this show up, could you give us some examples of how you've interrupted this possession, and what would you say to people in closing?
Well, we can do this briefly, but
Yeah. Oh, this is going to be a whole new show, Jerry, but I think we'll have to come back and do that. But just to round things up for today, because that will get people interested to come back again and listen to more.
But you have to understand the premise of these things is they feed off of negative emotional energy. They can't create it themselves. Right? So they have to put these thoughts and feelings in your mind to where you're generating that negative emotional energy. They can't stand positive emotional energy. So they can't stand church. They can't stand positive spiritual anything. They can't stand reading the Bible. They can't stand reading, positive spiritual stuff. That weakens them. And they're going to, well, the way I operated to start with is, and this was in the prison because I could get away with it, was to tell the prisoner to do the opposite of what they were telling him to do. Now, this really upset the voices in a lot of times. And then the voices would come back and call me all kinds of names and, you're stupid and don't listen to him. He's crazy. But, the more they did the opposite, the weaker the voices got and the angrier they got with me. So Sherry came up with something called That's a Lie program. These things, and the premise is everything they tell you, everything the voices tell you about yourself that's bad is a lie. And if you just keep throwing that in their face, now this is just one aspect of it. There's a whole lot of aspects to, how to get rid of these things. And Sherry got rid of them on her own. And I faced an inquisition in the prison because prisoner after prisoner after prisoner stopped taking their meds and showed no psychotic symptoms. And I got pulled up before the medical director and the inquisitor said, "What are you doing?" Well, I couldn't tell him what I was doing. Well, the chief psychologist, well, you were experimenting with prisoners without permission. How do you know that? Well, because this isn't supposed to happen. There is no cure. They shouldn't be coming. I thought they'd be happy about it. Look at all the money they were saving on antipsychotic drugs. No, they pulled me up in front of a damn inquisition and accusing me of curing these people, and threatening me for doing that. I couldn't freaking believe it. Couldn't believe it. And in prison, it's no good deed goes unpunished in a prison. That is the hog trough for these entities. That is their major feeding ground. Nothing good is allowed to happen in those places. And by society putting people in there, they put psychotic people in there. They've taken over for the state hospitals. The state hospitals closed down. These psychotics they can't make money. They can't hold a job. They commit crimes. They get thrown in prison. It's a negative, horrible environment. They become more violent, more cold, more callous, and then they're released back onto society. I mean, it's insanity. I've seen them release patients or prisoners that I knew would kill somebody in 6 months, but their time was up. They got to go. Their time's up. On the other hand, if a prisoner escapes and he runs out in the community, the news are like, "Oh, a murderer has escaped. He's going to kill everybody. You better lock your doors." I mean, at the same time, they're releasing 25 murderers a day into the society with $50 or nothing, with no job, and say, "Okay, you've done your time. You paid society back. Go." And there's nothing said about that. You talk about insanity. That's insanity. That's total insanity.
Well, yeah, a few years ago, they had a thing called Care in the Community here, and it was always on the news that some dangerous schizophrenic had stabbed somebody. But we're talking about crime on a much bigger level than that's never heard about, because I was talking to a solicitor recently, and he said, we were talking about a certain case, and he said, well, look, the way it works is this. If someone's mentally ill, they're much more likely to put them in prison. And that actually surprised me, but it doesn't now, knowing what I know now, because that's exactly the way the system works. They're farming this crime and they're creating more, and they want society to be disordered. This is the whole point, and people don't understand that we are in a destabilization process at the moment.
And prisons are one of the biggest. It's like a graduate school for crime. They come out of there cold, they come out of there hardened, they come out of there resentful and angry. The rehabilitation programs have been cut to a minimum. Private prisons are taken over who don't give a damn about prisoners or anything but making money. It's a graduate school for prisoners. Psychotics are whipped up and frenzied into a worse state. They're more unstable than when they came in. They're released on society with with 2 weeks worth of drugs and told to go to the nearest emergency room when they run out. I mean, this is rip-roaring insanity. It's insanity. Yet it's
it's getting worse over here because obviously we're going to have these huge private prisons, and we actually reported a few years ago on prisons like Sodexo prisons, the absolute horrific neglect and abuse that was going on there, like pregnant women giving birth on their own in cold white rooms with nobody there, and just the abuse and the people that are running these prisons purely for profit, and of course the minimum wage staff that they're getting to impose all this stuff within the prisons. And I think that even where I am in Kent, there was a riot at the local prison. They seem to have riots there every few months. You know, there's a really serious riot in all the prisons now. This is like an epidemic of that going on. They're losing control of what's happening inside the prison. So that was great, Jerry. We'll have to come back again and reconvene because we didn't get into a lot of the things I wanted to put across. But I think this is such a big subject, and I hope that has really got people interested to come back and hear some more. But thanks a lot for being on the show.
Yeah, they won't find this in any books. It won't exist in any books. This is frontline stuff that can only be gotten on the front lines. I mean, I saw more schizophrenics in a week than most people saw in a lifetime. You know, and like I said, these entities are, it's very clear with schizophrenics, but they affect us all to different degrees. You know, every negative thought that flows into your head, where do you think it comes from? You know?
No, exactly. And that's food for thought for everybody, that we should all be self-aware and be watching out for negative energy, because there's a lot of it about. And once those doors are opened and you have something wrong with you, the way these things find their way in is basically when your psyche has been attacked or you're open to it. And it's kind of as simple as that. That's great, Jerry. We're going to put up your websites. Would you like to say them? But we are going to put them on the screen.
I didn't understand your question.
All right, your websites. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you just put them on the on?
Absolutely, yeah. Because we've got Sherry's as well. Keyholejourney.com. Yes. We've got your YouTube, Dr. J, Jerry Marzinsky, and a Facebook page, The Presence of Other Worlds in Schizophrenia.
Yes.
That's great, Jerry. Thanks a lot. So back to you, Tony.
Excellent. Thank you, Jerry. I've really enjoyed the show tonight, and I can't wait to listen to it again. So there's a lot to digest in there, and getting you back on is going to be good because we've got a lot of questions and comments in the chat tonight. Thanks, as always, to everyone for those. And they will come out next time on the show. There was a lot to get through tonight, obviously, and we're overrunning a bit here, but that doesn't really matter that much. What matters is that you've all listened. Hopefully you've got something from it. I know I have, and we will be back here next week.
Windows on the World live every Sunday, 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Join me, Mark Windows, and Tony Hurst. Join the conversation in our chat box, and also catch up with life-changing information on our continuous program stream at windowsontheworld.net.